Welcome back to Mr. Nightmare Scares You. For new listeners entering this dark space for the first time, prepare to have your minds tested. And for veterans already familiar with the horrors that inhabit our channel, turn off the lights, lock the doors, and get comfortable if you can. Before we begin the story, let's meet someone who lived through this terrifying experience. William, 34, from Seattle, Washington, shared this story that will change the way you see the night and the most isolated areas of our country. There is a specific kind of silence that you only find when you are at least 50 miles away from any paved road. It's not a peaceful silence, the kind you seek for meditation or relaxation. It's a heavy, oppressive silence, as if nature itself were holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I discovered this the hard way. My name is William, and what I'm about to share with you isn't a delusion or a hallucination caused by exhaustion. It's the purest and most disturbing truth that completely shattered my perception of what inhabits the deep forests of our continent. I've always been a skeptical guy, someone who only trusted what I could touch and measure. I worked in technology in Seattle, surrounded by concrete, artificial lights, and the false sense of security that big cities provide. But the pressure of work was consuming me. Insomnia had become my constant companion, and the stress pushed me to a dangerous limit. It was then that an acquaintance, someone I considered a trusted friend, told me about an exclusive spiritual retreat. He described the place as an ancestral refuge located deep within an Indian reservation in Washington state, a sacred place where modern man could reconnect with the earth and purify his mind. He assured me there would be no technology, no distractions, just untouched nature and ancient purification rituals. I was desperate for peace, so I accepted. I packed my bags, got in my truck and drove for hours, leaving civilization behind. The outside temperature was a pleasant 65 degrees Fahrenheit when I left home, but as I ventured deeper into the dirt roads surrounded by towering pine trees, the air grew abnormally cold. The dashboard thermometer plummeted rapidly to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, bringing a damp chill that felt like it penetrated my bones. I had no idea I was driving straight into a nightmare from which I would never fully recover. The darkness of those woods hides things that shouldn't exist, and worse, things that some people know very well are there. The drive to the retreat was a gradual descent into the unknown. The GPS map stopped working shortly after I passed the sign marking the start of the reserve's territory. From that point on, I relied solely on a hand-drawn map my acquaintance had given me. The roads narrowed until they became mere dirt and gravel tracks, lined with trees so tall and dense that they blocked almost all sunlight, even in the middle of the afternoon. With every mile I advanced, the feeling of isolation increased exponentially. The car radio emitted only static, and my cell phone lost signal dozens of miles back. The journey required me to drive at no more than 15 miles per hour to avoid damaging the suspension on the deep potholes and exposed roots. On this slow and winding road, I began to notice small details that made me uneasy. On some trees there were deep marks in the bark, parallel scratches that started almost 9 feet from the ground and tore through the wood to the base. I tried to rationalize, thinking that perhaps they were bears, but the height and brutality of the marks didn't make sense for the local fauna. Furthermore, the absence of wildlife was remarkable. No birds crossed the sky, no deer ran through the vegetation. The forest was dead, static. Finally, after nearly 3 hours navigating this green labyrinth, I arrived at a wide clearing. There was a cluster of old wooden cabins arranged in a semicircle around a large central campfire, which was currently unlit. I parked the truck and got out. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and old smoke. I was greeted by an older man with harsh features and an impenetrable gaze, who introduced himself as the guardian of the place. He didn't smile. There were no warm words of welcome. He simply pointed to an isolated cabin at the edge of the camp near the tree line and said that this would be my lodging. The instruction was clear. I should not leave the cabin after sunset under any circumstances. I thought it was just a rule of the retreat, part of the process of isolation and introspection. I couldn't have been more wrong. The cabin's interior was utterly rustic. There was no electricity, just an oil lamp on a small wooden table, a simple bed with heavy blankets, and a small window overlooking the dense wall of trees in the back. The space measured about 10 by 12 feet, cramped and claustrophobic. The wood creaked under my feet with every movement, and the air inside was incredibly cold. I estimate no more than 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking and trying to adjust to the complete absence of the sounds of civilization. However, the quiet soon began to fray my nerves. As I walked through the camp before nightfall, I observed the other participants and the locals. There was a palpable tension in the air, something that didn't match the promise of a relaxing spiritual retreat. People moved methodically, almost mechanically, with furtive glances constantly cast towards the deep forest. No one spoke aloud. When I tried to approach a small group stacking firewood, the conversations ceased abruptly, and they stared at me with expressions that mixed distrust and a strange pity. I felt a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. It was then that I noticed something bizarre in the center of the camp. Behind the main campfire area, near the trail leading deep into the woods, was a large stone table. On it lay an absurd amount of raw meat, large cuts, which appeared to be from deer arranged in an almost ceremonial manner. I thought it was some kind of traditional offering or part of a ritual that would take place later. I tried to ask the warden about it, but he just looked at me with frightening severity and reinforced the rule that I should lock myself in the cabin as soon as the sun disappeared below the horizon. The haste with which everyone began to retreat to their lodgings as the sky began to darken left me with a queasy stomach. Night fell quickly, engulfing the camp in absolute darkness. I locked my cabin door with its heavy iron latch and lit the oil lamp. The yellowish light cast unsettling shadows on the wooden walls. I sat on the bed, covered with heavy blankets, trying to read a book in the dim light. But concentration was impossible. As the hours passed, the silence of the forest was replaced by a macabre symphony. The wind began to blow strongly through the branches, sounding like indistinct whispers, but soon other, more disturbing noises began to emerge from outside. First, there was the smell. It seeped into the cracks in the floorboards and the edges of the window. It was a repulsive, penetrating odor, a nauseating mixture of wet puppy fur, decaying flesh, and a strong metallic smell, like copper or old blood. The smell was so thick it made me gag, forcing me to cover my nose and mouth with my shirt. Then I heard the footsteps. They weren't human footsteps. They were heavy, widely spaced footsteps that sank into the earth with tremendous force. Something of gigantic proportions was walking around the perimeter of the camp. The sound of gravel and dry branches being crushed indicated that the creature was moving bipedally. My heart began to pound so hard it felt like it wanted to tear my chest apart. The breathing outside was deep, hoarse, and cavernous, sounding more like the bellows of a furnace than the lungs of an animal. The being stopped right behind my cabin. The wooden wall seemed to vibrate when something touched it. The feeling of psychological terror was paralyzing. I knew there was only a thin layer of old wood between me and whatever was lurking in the darkness, and the certainty that this thing knew perfectly well that I was inside left me on the verge of utter despair. Curiosity, fueled by a massive dose of adrenaline, overcame common sense. I dragged myself across the wooden floor, trying not to make the slightest noise, until I reached the small window overlooking the back of the cabin. The thin curtain was slightly ajar, leaving a narrow slit through which the pale light of the full moon streamed. With trembling hands, I brought my face close to the cold glass and peered out, praying not to see anything but trees, and the usual shadows of the night. What I saw, however, completely shattered any sense of reality I had. About 20 feet from my window, illuminated by the silvery moonlight, was a monstrous silhouette. The creature stood on two hind legs that possessed the inverted anatomy of a canine, thick and covered in taut muscles and a dark, shaggy coat. The abomination was at least 8, maybe 9 feet tall. Its shoulders were far too broad, supporting long arms that ended in enormous hands, equipped with claws that measured inches of pure, sharp terror. But worst of all was its head. He turned his snout slowly toward the center of the camp. It was a head that perfectly resembled that of an incredibly massive wolf, with pointed ears and elongated jaws. However, there was an almost human perversion in the way his eyes reflected light, emanating a malevolent yellowish glow, laden with a wicked intelligence. He wasn't just a rabid animal, he knew what he was doing. Through the window, I watched in paralyzing shock as the creature moved with terrifying fluidity toward the stone table where the raw meat had been left. This wasn't a retreat. It was a feast, and the people there didn't fear him out of ignorance. They knew him. They fed him. I stood frozen before that small window, watching in utter terror as the monster approached the stone table. My mind struggled violently to process the image of that abomination, trying to find any logical explanation that justified the existence of such a grotesque being, but there was none. It bent over the raw meat with a posture that mixed the savagery of a hungry predator with a frighteningly human dexterity. With its enormous hands adorned with lethal claws, it seized one of the large pieces of deer and brought it to its mouth, tearing muscle and bone with an ease that made my stomach churn. The sound of bones breaking under the pressure of those massive jaws echoed through the silent camp, a dry, brutal noise that seemed to reverberate inside my own head. I could see the muscles of its broad back contracting beneath the dark fur with each aggressive movement it made to devour its meal. The moonlight revealed the dark blood trickling down its elongated snout, staining the fur on its neck and chest. The smell of rot and copper became even stronger and more unbearable. The most disturbing realization wasn't just the sight of the monster itself, but the immediate understanding of the entire scene around me. Those people weren't there to meditate, seek inner peace, or reconnect with nature peacefully. That spiritual retreat in the middle of Washington's ancient forests was, in fact, a kind of dark cult, a group of people who dedicated their nights to feeding and appeasing this forest demon. They knew perfectly well that it inhabited those dark woods. The stone table wasn't an altar for abstract rituals, but a macabre feeding trough designed to keep the beast satisfied and away from the doors of their fragile cabins. The isolation, the prohibition against leaving after sunset, the absolute silence imposed by the camp leaders, everything fit together like pieces of a blood-soaked puzzle. I had been lured into a trap, placed in the center of the hunting grounds of a living, lethal legend. And as he finished devouring the last pieces of meat on the table, the monster stopped abruptly, raised its gigantic snout, and sniffed the night air in the exact direction of my cabin, making me recoil into the shadows of the room with my heart about to fail. The night seemed to last a painful eternity. I didn't sleep a wink, huddled in the darkest corner of the room, hugging my knees and listening intently to every whisper of the wind outside. When the first rays of sunlight finally began to penetrate the cracks in the wooden planks, bringing a pale, cold gray into the room, I stood up, my muscles stiff and aching from the extreme tension. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped drastically during the night, and the air from my mouth turned into an instant white mist. By my estimate, it must have been around 35 degrees Fahrenheit. I unlocked the heavy iron door with trembling hands and pushed the wood, hesitating before taking my first step outside. The morning mountain air hit my face like blades of ice, but what truly shocked me was the absolute normalcy of the camp. People were beginning to emerge from their lodgings, donning thick woolen coats and walking toward the center of the clearing. A campfire was already being lit by some men, and the strong smell of coffee was beginning to mask the residual odor of blood and death that still permeated the ground. I cautiously walked to the central area, my eyes fixed on the stone table. It was empty. There wasn't the slightest sign of the large chunks of raw meat I had seen the previous night, only dark, deep stains embedded in the porous surface of the rock. No one was talking about what had happened. No one mentioned the noises, the heavy footsteps, or the 9-foot-tall monster that had been there hours before. They acted with such calculated nonchalance that it made me nauseous, conversing in hushed tones about daily tasks and purification rituals, as if the previous night had been nothing more than a peaceful dream. The weight of the isolation became overwhelming. We were surrounded by miles and miles of dense, impenetrable forest, and I was the only one there who seemed to be suffering the side effects of that insanity. Determined to find answers, and more importantly, a way to escape that hell, I sought out the older man who had greeted me the previous day. I found him near the edge of the trees, stacking logs with a strength that belied his advanced age. I approached him with firm steps, trying not to show the panic that still boiled in my blood, and openly questioned him about what I had seen the previous night, about the gigantic animal and the meat on the stone table. I thought he would deny it, call me crazy, or invent some excuse about bears of abnormal proportions. Instead, he stopped what he was doing, wiped his dirt-covered hands on his worn trousers, and looked at me with an expression of resignation and profound sadness, an expression that confirmed all my worst fears. He spoke in an incredibly low voice, warning me not to ask questions I couldn't bear to hear the answers to, explaining that some lands don't belong to men, and that we were merely tolerated visitors under very specific conditions. He confirmed that the being I had seen had been roaming that reserve for generations, long before any city was built in the state, and that the agreement to maintain peace required nightly sacrifices. When I asked about leaving, about getting my truck and driving the nearly 50 miles back to the main road, the old man's gaze became grim and authoritative. He told me firmly that the forest roads were unsafe during those days of low fog, that his hunting territory extended throughout the perimeter of the reserve, and that trying to escape alone through the dense woods would be an instant and brutal death sentence. I was effectively a prisoner of that place, a hostage of a cursed agreement made between fanatics and a monstrous aberration, with no cell phone signal, no internet, and no possibility of calling for help from the outside world. The impossibility of escape forced me to try to understand the terrain where I was confined, searching for any flaw in the camp's security or any alternative route. I spent the rest of the day walking the perimeter of the clearing, always keeping the safe area in sight and never venturing more than a few dozen feet into the tree line. The forest was oppressive. The colossal pine trees blocked sunlight almost completely, creating an environment of perpetual damp twilight. It was during this desperate inspection that I found the physical evidence of that damned monster's presence. On the soft ground near a small stream that cut along the side of the camp, I saw the footprints. They were disturbing, mixing canine characteristics with gigantic proportions. The sole and toes sank deep into the earth, indicating a weight that must have exceeded 800 pounds. I mentally measured the size of the impression and calculated that each footprint was at least 15 inches long, large enough to swallow my own entire foot inside the mark in the ground. Further on, I came across an ancient tree whose bark had been completely shattered. The trunk was marked by parallel, deep and violent cuts where sap still slowly seeped out as if the tree were bleeding. I approached to assess the extent of the damage. The scratches began at an unbelievable point, easily reaching a 10-foot mark on the trunk, far beyond the reach of any adult grizzly bear, and descended, tearing through the wood with a force that defied physics. Standing there, staring at those colossal marks, materialized the threat in a way that was impossible to ignore. The residual smell of wet, putrid fur still lingered near the tree's roots, warning my most primal instincts that I was stepping into the backyard of a merciless super-predator. The feeling of being constantly watched, of having yellow eyes fixed on my back from the darkness of the bushes, began to rapidly erode my sanity, leaving me in a state of constant hypervigilance. The sun's decline on the horizon brought with it a wave of widespread panic in my chest. As daylight began to fade, the temperature plummeted again, quickly reaching a biting 32 degrees Fahrenheit. From my cabin's porch, I observed the unsettling behavior of the camp members. The same grim routine from the previous day repeated itself with mathematical precision. 2 burly men emerged from a locked shed in the back, carrying large metal basins, and the metallic smell of fresh blood filled the frigid air. They walked to the stone table and placed fresh cuts of meat on the surface, arranging everything with a reverential silence that made my stomach churn. No one smiled, no one spoke. They simply performed their funereal tasks under the dim orange light of the late afternoon. As the last ray of sunlight was swallowed by the mountains, the heavy sound of the camp bell tolled once, and everyone dispersed in quick, silent steps to their respective lodgings. I locked the heavy door of my cabin, closed the old curtains, and sat on the bed with my back to the wall, clutching a small folding knife from my pocket, the only pathetic weapon I possessed. Total darkness enveloped the room, broken only by the dim light of the small oil lamp. And then, punctual as death itself, the symphony of terror began again. The sound of thick branches snapping in the depths of the forest indicated that it was approaching once more. The cold air of the cabin mingled with that foul odor of carnage and damp fur. I knew the monster was returning for its feast, but this time, intuition screamed in the back of my mind that something was terribly wrong, and that the hunger of that giant abomination would not be satisfied with just the flesh left on the cold stone. The darkness inside that cabin seemed to have gained an almost physical density, pressing against my lungs and making each breath difficult. I sat on the uneven floorboards, clutching my knees and paying attention to every sway of the icy wind outside. The temperature plummeted dramatically that night, and I estimate the thermometers must have easily reached 30 degrees Fahrenheit, transforming the air's humidity into a thick fog that engulfed the camp. My hands were frozen, but the cold sweat running down my neck was proof of the absolute terror that gripped me. And then, the indescribable odor of putrefaction and damp fur began to seep through the cracks in the window, announcing the arrival of the abomination. The smell was so potent that it caused almost immediate nausea. I heard the enormous weight of that creature, crushing the undergrowth as it approached the central area of the cabins, its heavy, methodical steps making the ground vibrate slightly beneath my feet. This time, however, something was fundamentally different from the previous night. I crawled to the small window, driven by a sick mixture of curiosity and survival instinct, and peered through the crack in the dusty curtain. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the mist, but I could make out the massive 9-foot-tall silhouette standing near the stone table. The monster didn't bend down to devour the fresh meat the men from the camp had left hours before. It simply ignored the offering. That grotesque bipedal wolf stood motionless for a few minutes, its broad shoulders tense and its elongated snout raised, sniffing the air in various directions. It was at that moment that true panic gripped my mind. The creature began to slowly turn its head toward my cabin. Those yellow, malevolent eyes, reflecting a brutal predatory intelligence, seemed to lock directly onto my window, piercing the darkness and meeting my terrified gaze. It wasn't there to eat dead deer. He was hunting, and the target that night was different. My whole body froze in a paralyzing spasm of terror when I saw the creature take its first step toward my lodging. The roughly 40 feet separating us were covered in a matter of seconds with an agility that something so massive shouldn't possess. I quickly moved away from the window, crawling backward across the floor until I was against the opposite wall, clutching the small knife to my chest as if that tiny blade could offer me any chance of defense. The heavy sound of the monster's cavernous breathing echoed from the other side of the thin wooden wall of my cabin. It was a deep, harsh panting, laden with the metallic smell of old blood. I felt the vibration in the floor as it stopped directly in front of my door. The psychological tension of that moment was excruciating. I watched the dark iron doorknob begin to turn slowly, forced by gigantic hands equipped with claws that must have easily measured 5 inches of pure, sharp bone. The monster was testing the entrance. The metal creaked under the extreme pressure, and the entire structure of the cabin protested, the wooden planks creaking under the weight of that abomination now leaning against the outer wall. The massive shadow completely blocked the little light that entered from under the door. I held my breath, fearing that even the sound of air leaving my lungs could incite a brutal attack. The pressure exerted against the wood continued for several minutes, while the creature sniffed the perimeter, like a hunting dog calculating the best way to extract its prey from a fragile burrow. I waited for the exact moment when the door would give way, mentally calculating how many seconds of life I had left. The monster eventually retreated, disappearing into the darkness of the forest just before dawn, leaving behind a trail of putrid smell and a hut whose walls seemed to have buckled slightly under its weight. When the first beams of cold grey light finally appeared, I was on the verge of mental exhaustion, trembling uncontrollably not only from the 32-degree Fahrenheit cold, but from the traumatic shock of the early morning. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the camp's central courtyard. The atmosphere among the inhabitants was not the same as in previous days. There was a nervous rush and an unspoken fear permeating everyone's actions. I walked to the stone table and my stomach dropped when I realized the reason for the general despair. The enormous pile of meat remained exactly where it had been placed the day before. The offering had not been accepted. I cautiously approached the oldest man, the group's leader, who stared at the untouched meat with wide eyes and trembling hands. I didn't need to ask questions. I could hear fragments of the muffled conversation he was having with 2 other strong men. They were discussing in urgent tones how the pact had been broken and how the beast was dissatisfied, demanding a different sacrifice. The sidelong glances they cast at me, laden with dark guilt and a certain sickly relief, made my suspicions incredibly clear. I was the outsider. I was the fresh meat. The spiritual retreat was a bright, cursed facade designed to lure unsuspecting prey, guaranteeing the safety of the cult members in exchange for my life. The tension became palpable, thick as black smoke, and I knew I wouldn't get past another night if I stayed in that cursed place. Driven by a primal survival instinct, I decided I would flee that nightmare as soon as the sun was at its highest point. I returned to my cabin, haphazardly gathered my clothes into my backpack and grabbed the keys to my truck. The idea of driving for hours on those bumpy dirt roads no longer frightened me. Nothing in the world would scare me more than the creature from the previous night. I walked with long, determined strides toward the clearing where the vehicles were parked, located about 50 yards from the center of the camp. My vehicle was exactly where I had left it, covered by a thin layer of frozen dew. I removed the alarm and opened the door, feeling a fleeting wave of relief as I sat in the driver's leather seat. I turned the key in the ignition, expecting to hear the comforting roar of the engine, but all I got was a lifeless metallic click. I tried again, flooring the accelerator, but the vehicle was completely dead. Despair overwhelmed me. I got out of the car and went to the front, pulling the lever to open the hood. The scene that unfolded shattered my last spark of hope. The truck's battery hadn't just failed. It had been violently ripped from its place. The thick cables were chewed and torn, and there were deep scratches on the engine's metal that only very long claws could have made. The monster didn't just hunt. It possessed a sick strategic intelligence. It had sabotaged my only means of transportation, ensuring I was trapped in that forest trap. We were almost 40 miles from the nearest civilization, a completely impossible distance to cover on foot through that dense woods, especially with a super predator on my tail. I spent the rest of the day trying to fix the cables in vain, my hands cut and bleeding from the futile effort on the truck's destroyed engine. As the sun began to set behind the wall of giant pine trees, painting the sky with shades of dark red reminiscent of old blood, the activity in the camp changed drastically. Unlike other days when the men would put the meat on the stone table, today there were no preparations. The villagers retreated to their reinforced huts long before nightfall. There was no conversation, no eye contact. They were sealing their doors with heavy wooden and metal locks, turning off the lights, and preparing for the storm of violence that was about to break. I found myself alone in the center of the clearing, enveloped in the icy wind that caused the temperature to drop below 30 degrees Fahrenheit once more. The silence that settled in was deafening and lethal. I walked slowly back to my own cabin, dragging my feet on the gravel, fully aware that the thin wooden walls of that isolated shack would be no match for the colossal strength of that enraged creature. I went inside and locked the door, knowing full well it was a futile measure. I sat on the ground, leaning against the wall opposite the window, and opened my pocket knife. Total darkness enveloped the Indian reservation once more, and shortly after, the unbearable stench of putrefaction filled the air around me again. The night of the slaughter had begun, and there was no one within tens of miles who could hear my screams. The darkness became absolute when the oil lamp consumed its last drop of fuel, extinguishing itself with a faint hiss and leaving me plunged into an impenetrable gloom. I was huddled against the back wall of my 10 by 12-foot cabin, feeling the rough wood through my thin shirt. The intense cold, nearing 28 degrees Fahrenheit, was paralyzing, but my body trembled for something far darker. Outside, the heavy breathing of that monstrosity began to circulate around the cabin. I could hear the wet sound of its snout, violently sniffing the cracks in the window, searching for my scent with the precision of a seasoned predator. The odor of rotting flesh and stagnant blood filled the air, thick enough to make me gag and tear up. Suddenly, the movement outside stopped. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a frozen eternity. Then the front door, made of thick oak and reinforced with iron bolts, suffered the first impact. It wasn't an animal shove, but a calculated and massive blow, delivered with devastating force that made the entire structure of the cabin tremble from its foundations. The floorboards creaked violently, and the door frame began to give way under the immense pressure. The monster was using its own gigantic 9-foot-tall body as a battering ram, striking the wood repeatedly. With each impact, I felt the vibrations rise up my legs, warning me that my pathetic refuge was about to disintegrate. The iron bolt began to visibly bend, and the hinges began to detach from the wall, sending sharp splinters of wood flying into the frigid air of the room. I gripped the handle of my small folding knife, knowing that the 3-inch blade wouldn't even make a scratch on the thick hide of that abomination. With a final, devastating impact of splintering wood, the entire door was ripped from its frame and hurled into the cabin, landing heavily a few feet from where I huddled. A blast of freezing air filled the room, bringing with it the physical presence of the demon. Through the gaping opening, illuminated only by the faint moonlight battling the thick fog, it entered. The creature had to bend almost halfway to fit through the doorway, and even then its massive shoulders scraped against the shattered frame. Being in the same room as that abomination was an experience of pure, indescribable terror, something no human mind is prepared to process. The cabin suddenly seemed tiny, completely dominated by the beast's muscular mass and dark fur. It rose slowly, scraping its pointed ears and the top of its lupine head against the low wooden ceiling. Its luminous yellow eyes swept across the dark room until they fixed on me. There was a sick, sadistic intelligence in that gaze, a perverse understanding that I was cornered, terrified, and completely at its mercy. It didn't rush to attack me immediately. Instead, it took slow, deliberate steps toward me, savoring every second of my utter panic. The claws on its hands, which looked like curved butcher knives, scraped the wooden floor with each heavy step, leaving deep furrows in the floor. The creature's hoarse, cavernous breath filled the air, and with each exhalation a cloud of fetid vapor hit my face. I was paralyzed, inches from its wet snout full of sharp teeth that could tear through steel. Death was there, staring me down, and it took the form of an ancient nightmare. The moment the monster raised one of its massive arms to deliver the fatal blow, the shack's unstable base, already compromised by violent impacts, gave way under the combined weight of the creature and the rotting floor. With a dry sound of structural rupture, the boards beneath the beast's feet shattered completely, causing one of its canine legs to sink up to its hip into the space beneath the floor. The abomination's sudden surprise and imbalance gave me a window of opportunity of at most 2 seconds. Driven by an irrational adrenaline rush, I threw myself toward the glass window on the opposite side. I didn't bother opening it. I simply used my weight to shatter the glass, covering my face with my arms. The pain of the cuts was ignored by my brain, focused only on survival. I fell heavily onto the hard, frozen ground outside, landing on my shoulder and rolling across the gravel. I instinctively stood up and ran. I ran toward the wall of dark, towering pine trees, fleeing the locked huts where the cowards hid. I ran through the damp forest, dodging treacherous roots and low branches that scratched my face and tore my clothes. Behind me, I heard the sound of the entire wall of my hut being destroyed as the monster broke free from its accidental trap. It was furious, and the hunt had begun lethally. I had no direction, only the blind need to put as many miles as possible between me and the camp. After running about 800 feet into the forest, I tripped over something massive and fell face down in a shallow ditch. When I stood up, the faint moonlight revealed the macabre truth that sealed the fate of all outsiders. The ditch was littered with torn backpacks, jackets stained with dark blood, and old human bones. The hidden graveyard of the cult's offerings. The sight of that pit of bones drained all the energy I had left. The smell wasn't just of the monster. The forest surrounding the camp was a silent slaughterhouse. I tried to crawl out of the ditch, my hands sinking into the cold earth and the abandoned remains of countless forgotten victims. The panic of understanding the scale of that trap almost made me faint. The cult had been feeding this abomination for decades, ensuring its own safety by offering strangers under the guise of a healing haven. I was gasping for breath, the icy air tearing at my exhausted lungs, when I realized the silence of the forest had returned. The sound of my pounding heart seemed too loud. The fetid smell of the demon was no longer diluted by the wind. It was concentrated, hovering in the static air high above me. I looked slowly upwards, towards the top of the dark earthen ditch, and my blood froze in my veins. It was there. The colossal being stood on the edge, its massive 9-foot silhouette silhouetted against the darkness of the pine trees, watching me with terrifying stillness. Its pointed ears were aimed directly at me, picking up every sound of my agony. It descended the dirt slope with a smoothness that defied its monstrosity, moving not like a beast blinded by hunger, but like a lethal predator cornering its final prey. The creature drew closer until it was a mere 2 feet away. The size of its snout, filled with teeth that looked like sharp blades, its scalding breath exhaling the odor of an ancient cemetery, and the perception of the brute force radiating from that body left me completely incapable of attempting any escape. I was trapped in the grave made for me. The abomination raised its gigantic hand, and claws measuring inches of pure terror gleamed dull in the darkness, ready to tear my flesh. In a movement of pure suicidal instinct, I desperately groped the ground around me and found a thick, sharp branch of dead oak. The moment the monster's arm descended to deliver the final blow, I used both hands to raise the branch at a defensive, pointed angle toward its chest. The force of the monster's impact against the branch was overwhelming, making the bones in my arms nearly crack under the pressure. But the sharp wooden point only slightly pierced the dense muscle between the animal's ribs, causing a superficial wound. This didn't kill it, and hardly slowed it down for long, but the shock of encountering unexpected resistance made the creature recoil half a step and emit a terrifying deep sound of fury and pain, a monstrous gasp that shook the dry leaves on the ground around it. It was the only distraction I could muster in my entire life. Taking advantage of the beast's momentary hesitation, I violently rolled to the side, escaping its grasp by inches, and climbed the edge of the ditch, my hands bleeding and slippery. I didn't look back. I zigzagged through the massive trees, praying that the darkness would conceal me, and that the wound would keep it occupied, pulling the splinter from its own chest. The night forest was plunged into a biting 30-degree Fahrenheit cold, but I felt my body burning with heat. Survival would require running dozens of miles in a straight line to the nearest road, braving total darkness and the persistent threat of an enraged and deadly pursuer. The darkness of the forest engulfed my body in seconds as I ran desperately, driven by a surge of adrenaline that masked the pain of my torn muscles and bloodied hands. The temperature plummeted rapidly, and the invisible thermometers of that early morning must have been registering a cruel 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold air entered my lungs like shards of glass with each forced breath. I had no exact direction, only following the natural slope of the terrain, moving away from the cursed camp and the pit of bones that had almost become my final resting place. The colossal pine trees around me seemed to block the path, with low branches whipping my face and arms, leaving cuts that burned under the icy wind. I knew the creature hadn't been defeated. The sharp wooden branch I managed to drive into its massive chest was just a passing distraction, a minor physical inconvenience for a being that possessed 9 feet of pure muscle and lethal fury. At any moment, I expected to hear the heavy impact of that monster's paws crushing the forest floor right behind me. The hunt was only beginning. The uneven terrain was a constant trap. I stumbled over roots that rose from the ground like rigid tentacles and fell several times onto the frozen earth, hurting my knees and shoulders, but absolute panic forced me to get up and keep running in a continuous march of agony. I mentally calculated that the nearest paved road was about 40 miles away, an impossible journey to make on foot at night in a dense forest, but the alternative was certain death in the claws of that abomination. The instinct for survival silenced logic. As I advanced through the twilight, the smell of pine and damp earth began to be slowly replaced by a light breeze that carried the acrid odor of old metal and rotting oil, indicating that perhaps I was approaching some vestige of civilization or old logging operations. After walking and running for almost 2 hours straight, physical exhaustion began to take its toll. My legs were numb from the cold and the exertion, and my vision was starting to blur. It was then that, emerging from the thick fog that covered the forest floor, I spotted an old logging road, abandoned for decades. The dirt path was covered in brush and debris, but it was noticeably more open than the dense forest. About 500 feet ahead, outlined by the faint moonlight, I saw the silhouette of heavy machinery. It was a gigantic logging truck, completely rusted and forgotten by time, its tires rotted and its cab covered in dark moss. Knowing that my body wouldn't withstand the 25 degrees Fahrenheit temperature much longer, and that my trail of smell and blood was spread for miles through the forest, I decided to use that metal carcass as temporary shelter. I crawled to the side of the vehicle and forced open the crooked driver's side door. It gave way with a painful metallic creak. The interior reeked of mold and neglect, but offered minimal physical barrier against the biting wind and the open views of the dirt road. I huddled on the cab floor, hidden beneath the crumbling dashboard, hugging my knees in a desperate attempt to conserve any remaining body heat. I didn't dare look out the grimy windows. The silence of the night became oppressive again. I lay there, motionless in the dark, trying to control my gasping breath, praying that the mixture of the strong rust and old oil smell from the truck would mask the odor of my own fear and the blood staining my clothes. Minutes dragged on like hours, and then the nightmare found its trail again. The heavy vibration in the ground was the first warning. Even huddled on the metal floor of the truck, I felt the approach of gigantic footsteps that made the earth tremble slightly. The monster had arrived. The nauseating smell of wet fur, mixed with unmistakable rot, penetrated the cab through the rusty cracks. I immediately held my breath, closing my eyes tightly, as if the darkness could make me invisible. The creature didn't attack immediately. Instead, it initiated a brutal psychological siege. I heard the heavy sound of its claws slowly scraping the outer metal side of the truck, a dragging and agonizing noise that sent shocks of pure terror down my spine. It was circling the vehicle, assessing the metal's resistance, knowing perfectly well that its prey was trapped inside. The monster stopped right next to the door where I was huddled. A deep, hoarse breath sounded inches from my ear, separated only by a thin sheet of corroded steel. It sniffed the door forcefully, searching for my scent amidst the rust. The colossal pressure of the beast's body pressed against the truck, causing the entire structure to tilt dangerously to one side, threatening to topple and crush me against the ground. That 9-foot-tall evil being was toying with me, stretching my suffering to the brink of madness. I clutched my folding knife, knowing its uselessness but keeping it close to my chest like a funereal amulet. The torture lasted for over an hour. It scratched the roof, lightly tapped the hood, and continued its suffocating vigil until a subtle change in the atmosphere occurred. The sky through the cracks in the dashboard began to slowly brighten with the grey tones of the impending dawn. The weak sunlight seemed to be the only limit to that abomination. With one last violent scratch that pierced the metal of the door, the creature recoiled, its heavy steps receding into the dark depths of the reserve. I waited until the first rays of sunlight were piercing the tree canopy with clarity before daring to push open the truck door. My body was completely rigid, bordering on hypothermia, and every movement required a monumental effort. The morning light revealed the marks of terror. The side of the truck was covered in deep, gleaming grooves where the creature's 5-inch claws had peeled away the rust until they reached the bare metal. Without looking back, I began walking along the old logging road. The march was an excruciating test of human endurance. I covered about 15 miles that morning, stumbling, falling, and dragging my feet through the gravel. Hunger and dehydration clouded my senses, but the memory of the monster's yellow eyes served as a dark fuel that wouldn't let me stop. Around noon, the muffled sound of a combustion engine broke the natural silence of the forest. My heart leaped in my chest. I forced my legs to run the last 100 feet until the dirt road abruptly ended at the shoulder of a paved state highway. I had made it. I knelt on the hot asphalt, crying dry tears of pure relief. Minutes later, a cargo truck appeared on the horizon. I threw myself into the middle of the road, frantically waving my bloodied arms. The vehicle braked sharply, skidding and stopping a few meters from me. The driver, a weary-looking man, jumped out, his eyes wide with shock at the sight of my deplorable state. Clothes in tatters, skin cut, covered in dirt and dried blood. He didn't ask many questions. He helped me into the heated cab, locked the doors, and sped away from that cursed forest. As the trees receded into the rearview mirror, I felt that although my body was on its way to safety, a part of my soul had remained forever trapped in those dark woods. Months have passed since it happened, But the terror never truly went away. The police heard my account, recorded my statement about the isolated camp and the sinister inhabitants, but the investigation ended in a wall of silence and complicated jurisdictions due to the reserve's territory. The authorities treated the case as a delusion caused by extreme exposure to the elements, suggesting an attack by a common wild animal. But I know what I saw. I know what inhabited the absolute darkness of that place. The cult continues out there, operating its false spiritual retreat, attracting people seeking peace only to deliver them as bloody sacrifices on the stone table. They feed an ancient monstrosity to ensure their own cowardly survival. Today I sleep with the lights on, lock my doors 3 times, and never travel to places where there's no cell phone signal. I hope this confession of mine serves as a warning. The ancient legends about encounters with Dogman are not myths invented around campfires to scare children. They are terrifying stories based on authentic reports from people who stepped where they shouldn't have and discovered that humanity is not at the top of the food chain when the sunlight disappears. If you're invited to a secluded refuge deep in the forests and notice that people fall silent at sunset, don't wait for night to fall. Run. The darkness hides things that destroy the body and devour sanity. Thank you for joining us to the end of this disturbing tale. If this journey through the shadows made your heart race, be sure to like and subscribe to the Mr. Nightmare Scares You channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss our next videos delving into the unknown. Share this story with that friend who loves camping in the middle of nowhere, and leave a comment. What would you do if you found yourself in absolute isolation and a gigantic beast waiting outside your door? Stay safe and never trust the silence of the forest. Until next time.